We're here in Grafton Street today because Bradley Manning has been tortured in the United States. The last place Bradley Manning wasn't in jail and wasn't in a war zone was in Ciaron Airport in Ireland. Most US troops who went to Iraq to a war that the Pope said was immoral, that the UN said was illegal, and most people thought was unwinnable, went through Ciaron Airport, a small departure lounge at Ciaron Airport, including Bradley Manning. Now 4,000 of these young Americans have come home in body bags. 10,000 have come home with injuries they'll never recover from. They'll never be able to walk or talk again. Another 20,000 injured. Many who've come back have committed homicide and suicide. And Ireland is deeply complicit in that tragedy, which included over 1 million Iraqis being killed, mostly women and children. Now what I want us to do is to seriously consider offering Bradley Manning Irish citizenship and sanctuary in Ireland. We should ask the Americans to stop torturing him, to let him go, to let him come to Ireland and live a life. Now Bradley Manning and Julian Assange are two people that risk spending the rest of their lives in jail because of these wars that we are involved in. Now Bradley Manning was only 14 when this war started. His mother, who lives in Wales, suffered a series of strokes, has been visited by the FBI. Now I think those people who marched in this city, over 100,000 of them marched in the city in the February 2003, should seriously consider how much solidarity they should be offering to these two men who are looking at life imprisonment. And also, you can bet your bottom dollar that every member of the US military is looking at Bradley Manning as looking at his non-violent resistance to this war and looking at how much solidarity he's getting from the anti-war movement. And a lot of these people are considering not deploying to a war that they know is unwinnable, that they know there's no popular support for in North America or Europe or Australia. They know is immoral. They know basically it's the theft of resources from Iraqis and Afghanis. And they'll wonder how much support they would get if they refuse to get on one of those planes into the war zone. And that's why we need to be offering as much solidarity as possible to Bradley Manning at this point. Julian Assange has a verdict on Thursday. I will be at that court. Now it's very suspicious that the hearing has been moved from Westminster Magistrates Court to a court that was set up for the Provisional IRA at Woolwich. And it's attached to the Belmarsh prison, a Category A prison. The court is bomb-proof. It's attached by a secret or underground tunnel into the prison. So they've moved that court case to that setting to give it the context of terrorism. So both Assange and Manning are confronted by resources and power that's hard to get your head around. And the only anti-venom they've got for this is us, as normal people, ordinary people like yourselves and myself, doing what we can to raise their name, whether we scrawl Manning's name on a wall, whether we put out a leaflet, whether we speak about him in the streets, whether we demand the government that sold our Constitution out, a Constitution that has neutrality enshrined in it. And why is neutrality enshrined in the Irish Constitution? It's because the Irish did not believe in the imperial bloodbath that was World War I. And the British knew that. They did not conscript in the north or the south for World War I because they knew the Irish position was against such wars. Now we've sold that out. Now people like my grandfather fought for the independence of this country. They went to jail. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment for his resistance to imperialism here. He'd be spinning in his grave to see a US military base at Ciaron Airport visiting the same tragedies that were visited on the Irish people less than 100 years ago being visited on the people of Iraq. Less than 100 years ago, young men like you would be picked up from the streets, taken to Dublin Castle and tortured. Tortured and some died in Dublin Castle people that would be Afghan people that would be at the hands of the Americans. And we've been complicit in that by providing Ciaron Airport as a major pit stop for the US invasion of Iraq. Most US troops that went to Iraq for the invasion and occupation of Iraq went through this country, went through Ciaron Airport. Now I broke into that airport with 4 other people at the beginning of this war, and I disarmed and disabled with 4 other people a US warplane that was on its way to Iraq, and we sent that plane back to Texas where it belongs. Now we were dragged through Limerick prison. we were dragged through the courts here. I had to sign on at the Gardo station at Pearce Street for 2 years every day, and we were taken to court 3 times at the forecourt. The first trial collapsed when the judge was so excited and so keen to convict us and send us to jail that he acted illegally. And we were gifted with some of the best barristers in Ireland. He picked that up and the trial collapsed. The second judge knew what happened in the first trial. He let all the evidence in, but at the end he ruled out our defence under the Criminal Damage Act. Now, under Irish criminal law, if you damage property to preserve the life or property of another person, that is a defence to criminal damage. If there's a house on fire and you break open that door and you save the children and you're charged with criminal damage, you can run that defence and be acquitted. Now, that's the defence we ran. The second trial, the judge tried to collapse that defence. We went outside and we had an apparition who told us that this judge was a personal friend of the great American warlord George Bush Jr. And that this judge, we reminded this judge at the beginning of our second trial that he told the jury pool, if anyone is connected to any of these personalities in this trial and these issues surrounding the trial, they should absent themselves from the jury. And one woman who already was on the jury got up and said, look, my daughter is an airline stewardess. It might look like I'm prejudiced to the public if I participate in this trial. And our barrister jumped up and said, I want to congratulate you on your integrity. The judge, the clown of a judge that we had, got up and said, I too want to congratulate you on your integrity. But he sat there for 11 days when he had met George Bush Jr., when he was governor of Texas. He was introduced to him by the corrupt American Republican politician Tom DeLay, who's now in jail for corruption. He then was invited to both inaugurations of George Bush as president. He attended the first one, yet when we confronted him with this, he panicked. He went into the judge's chambers, whether he rang the Attorney General or whatever. He came back and collapsed the trial. We went to trial a third time, and at our trials, we had American veterans of the war. We had Jimmy Massey, who had shot unarmed civilians at checkpoints in Iraq, confessing to what he did, denouncing the war, telling his experiences. We had Kathy Kelly, who was in Baghdad during shock and awe and described the indiscriminate nature of the bombardment. People like you, just doing their shopping in Iraqi markets, were massacred by the Americans. And then we had Dennis Halliday, the great Irish Quaker, who was head of the UN Food for Oil program in the 1990s, who resigned from that position because he said it was a genocidal policy, the sanctions. We killed a million Iraqi children before the Americans even got there. And the jury, a Dublin jury, considered these questions and found us not guilty of $2.5 million criminal damage. Now in Dublin, 92% of criminal trials ended guilty verdicts. The others usually end in 10-2 or 11-1. It's nearly unheard of to have a unanimous acquittal. Now, the reason I'm concerned about Julian Assange and Bradley Manning, I spent over a year in prison in the United States. During the first Gulf War, I broke into an Air Force base with 3 other Catholic workers, and we disarmed a B-52 bomber and put it out of action for the length of that war. And we were in prison. Other B-52s were deployed to England. They dropped 30% of all the munitions dropped. In the first Gulf War, the equivalent of 8 Hiroshima bombings were dropped on the people of Iraq. 30% of that was B-52s taking off from England and Saudi Arabia and Diego Garcia, opening their bomb bay doors, dropping payloads of napalm and cluster bombs and fuel air explosives on the children of Iraq. Now we went to prison, and what's ironic is the footage that Bradley Manning has exposed, and you can see this on the web. It's called Collateral Murder. Just Google it. It's a helicopter gunship. They had the sights of unarmed Iraqis and 2 righteous journalists, and they opened fire on them and they massacre them, and you can see them running for their lives and cut down. You can then see a vehicle pulling up to tend to the wounded, and unfortunately in that vehicle there was a number of Iraqi children, and the order to come through, light them up, and they kill them, they massacre them. Now the people who gave those orders, the guy who pulled the trigger, is not being brought to court for his homicidal actions. Who's been brought to court? Bradley Manning for exposing that massacre, Julian Assange for publishing that massacre. Now this is one of the most significant trials